I got the idea to do this topic. It's almost 3 years ago now, but this conference called PIANC, PIANC. That is not English. It stands for the World Association for Waterborne Transport Infrastructure. And I really just went because I mainly just wanted to get out of the office. It was before I came back to work at UWF, so I was private sector. And get to meet some clients, of course, and do the schmoozing and everything else. But I also just tried to get an idea of where what we did fit into what everybody else was doing. So even though we're just trying to help people get through the permitting process, it gives you a better sense of how resources are going to be impacted at the very least, but also how to get people through the permitting process appropriately. So that was really the whole idea to go to this thing. But Pionk, they have a lot of coastal engineers, environmental scientists, dredging folks, marine construction, and then Port Authority representatives. Those are the main kind of groups represented. The largest group in attendance at the one I went to were all people with the Army Corps, and they represented a bunch of facets of it. But that kind of makes sense because in this country, at least, the Army Corps is dealing with most of this work in some way or another. During one of the presentations at the conference, there's a woman, Soupy Dalliander, really interesting name. But she was phenomenal. And she had just left working with the Army Corps, and she works for a nonprofit now. Um, but she really, her whole headline was quit calling it dredge spoil. This is a really beneficial resource that we just happen to be mining up for another purpose. But then when we have it, we need to be thinking about how we're going to use it. And that needs to happen way before the project occurs. And so, at the end, just quit calling it spoil, start calling it, material, beneficial sediment, whatever. And so I know with most of the attendees at the conference, they're thinking about habitat creation, shoreline stabilization, things like that, which are really great. But I'm thinking about all the coastal sites that I'd seen over the years that got capped as a part of like beach renourishments, which is really, that tends to favor higher income areas and all this. So it's always kind of like, yeah, we're seeing a benefit to it. Um, and conversely, in areas where they don't have access to those resources, because in the case of beach renourishments, this isn't dredged material from a channel. They are looking for clean sand, right? Like and dredging it up and pumping it over there. But then, yeah, all these sites and areas that have suffered from erosion and ultimately some sites being destroyed because they didn't have access to these protections. But certainly, I know of several shipwrecks and even shoreline infrastructural sites like wharves, shipsways, things like that, that have benefited from regular dredge material from channel expansions or maintenance dredging, even things like that, and just being capped with dredge material. And then Dr. Judy Benz gave a paper at SHA in 2019. And she was just highlighting, really mainly one site, but she brought the same topic up, basically saying, keep doing this. I don't know how to get you to do more of it, but Presidio Santa Rosa might not be here today if this wasn't happening because there was a considerable amount of dredge material that was placed that has buffered the effects of erosion there. And so in this talk, I'm mainly going to highlight some projects. Most of them I was somehow a part of, or at least I've known people that were working on them, and then some recommendations on how we fit in and can benefit from these beneficial sediments in the future. So spoil, that's the common nomenclature for ages, decades. It's still in common use by some folks. Most archaeologists are going to use the term spoil as well. It does conjure up these images like dirt, trash, muck, something that you want to throw away, go send it to a landfill. Um, you still see it on older navigation charts, and it's used as a descriptor too. So, like a spoil island or a spoil pile, things like that. So, the name is really closely tied to dredged material. It's on the books, like some state regulations still use the term currently in their the laws. North Carolina, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, I was pretty quickly able to find laws where they still were using the term spoil. But at the end of the day, we're dredging up large volumes of sediment from waterways, and that's primarily to provide easier access to ports. And as we produce increasingly large vessels, and just these massive freighters that come out, we're constantly fighting this battle where this port has been expanded to fit, the freighters that were around at that moment. Now there's bigger ones, so we need to expand again, which means we need to dredge deeper than we did the first time. Where maintenance dredging would be, we've had some sedimentation, some fill and shoaling, and we need to remove the sediment to get it back to where it was. This is like going deeper, and we've had massive projects, again, overseen, often sponsored by the Army Corps. Happening. But that material that they dredge up, it has to go somewhere. So there's a branding problem we have that, agencies and stakeholders have to contend with. Coastal engineers, dredgers, environmental scientists, and others, they're pushing to reframe spoil as just material. And so if you're talking to any of those types of folks, that's going to be the term you hear is at the very least material. And proposed usage, I've hit on a little bit already, but habitat creations and restoration, those are big ones. That's great. Beach renourishment where they can, because again, people, where they're getting the money to do renourishments, they want their nice white sandy beaches. But you do, there's certainly channel sands that fit the bill. Landfill cover, capping, landfill, great use of dredge material. And then land site remediation is another one. Those mainly fit all in the environmental ecological kind of sector. This has led to an increasingly common concept of beneficial use, though, amongst all of those folks, which is great. Because again, previously, this is just a nuisance. We got to find a place to dump this stuff, ending up in landfills or just massive zones, that it's just a dumping ground. Again, those spoil areas that you can still find on coastal charts. But now we can deploy it for the benefits of everyone for climate resilience, especially, which is great. So in the US, we removed on average 212 million cubic yards of material from our waterways from 2008 to 2012. And of this, 95% was considered non-contaminated. So you can use it as a resource for placement elsewhere. It's not a remediation situation where it has to go into a landfill or a specialized disposal facility. We have more than 400 ports, 200 deep water harbors, and 25,000 miles of navigation channels in the US. And that's generating massive amounts of material, which, as we said, considered waste product, still considered a waste product in many other countries, but increasingly less considered that way in this one, thankfully. In the US, we are still primarily disposing of dredged material in approved ocean water sites. I had mentioned before, you might be able to see on navigation charts where they've got designated, spoil zones or material deposit sites. But then we also have, again, beach renourishment areas, wetland creation zones, and then strategic placement in rivers to help, train the flow of rivers. I'm just going to mainly stick to U.S. legislation today because, of course, that's what's impacting us, what we're interested in. So in this country, dredge material is largely affected by 6 pieces of legislation. The Clean Water Act, National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, Toxic Substances Control Act, and the Coastal Zone Management Act, which I've highlighted here. So most archaeologists, especially if you're working in CRM, you already know kind of where cultural resources fit into NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. That's an easy one. But this talk I'm really getting at, I think we need to start inserting ourselves into the Coastal Zone Management Act stuff. And with NEPA, if you're familiar, and I think everybody on this call today is. But it calls for an interdisciplinary collaboration amongst the researchers. Planning and execution of coastal management plans actually demands a similar synthesis. So it's nice. It's a similar sort of framework that they're working in terms of consultation. In my brief conversations I've had with folks in the coastal management sphere, they seemed really receptive to including archaeologists or, cultural resource managers and things like that, and social scientists in this process. And it's already is happening. Just I don't think there's as many people that are familiar with it. Um, and that's really where it fits under, cultural resources as a part of the socio cultural impacts that they highlight specifically. So that is something to think about if you go on to sell this to coastal engineers, coastal managers, those sorts of things. Beneficial uses we have there's quite a few, and again I've hit on a lot of the sort of ecological ones that we have. But you can also make cement substitutes, construction products. They use it as fill for roadways. For us, though, it really is going back to those ecological benefits. So wetland creation, stabilization efforts, the best known one being beach renourishment, but we also have living shorelines, levee and ridge restorations and stabilizations. Those are a big one too. And PIONC had a working group on this specific topic, not cultural resources, but habitat creation, beneficial use of sediment more broadly. They quote, we developed the working with nature concept to consider project objectives in the context of ecosystem services and designs that rely on natural processes to achieve project objectives while yielding multiple economic, social, and environmental benefits. So they really are looking at getting the best bang for their buck when doing this. And it's interesting that they said economic first, because of course, as we know, the beach renourishments, there's a big economic benefit there. But second was social and certainly cultural resources, archaeological sites, historic sites. Those are amongst those benefits that they're talking about. And then environmental benefits was third. But whether that was intentional or not, I don't know. But they, at the very least, they're highlighting the social benefits, which is great. The first example, and I think several of you guys on the call are familiar with this project now, but the Bayou Sally Living Shoreline project, that's the first one I'm going to kind of talk about. Shoreline erosion has been a really big issue there on the eastern shoreline of Bayou Sally. They were losing an estimated 13 and a half feet per year as it's encroaching due to erosion. And it's destroying a lot of habitat, fish, and all sorts of wildlife. The really cool thing to me about this project is the Chitimacha tribe have been carrying the torch for this. And so they went after a grant with NOAA to spearhead this effort to create a living shoreline that would stabilize that stretch of the coast. Well, there were several sites in this area as well, and coastal environments, so Rich Weinstein and those guys, they were tasked with delineating and evaluating the two large shell middens in part of the project area. So that might have been where you guys would have heard about it. And they did a geophysical survey, including some kind of interesting new strategies and approaches they did that were really interesting. But they also did probing, augering, and all this to delineate both the terrestrial and the underwater components. So some of this, of course, it's already underwater. But it's this really nice project of ongoing consultation between the tribe, the archaeologists, the consulting agencies, and the other stakeholders to ensure really minimal impacts to the sites as they work on these long-term preservation efforts with the living shoreline. And of course, as part of that, they're bringing in aggregates. You can see the stone on there, but there's dredged sediments being brought in as well. So good example of sort of habitat stabilization and somewhat creation efforts that are helping to protect an archaeological site, or two archaeological sites specifically, probably more. Next example, I had mentioned briefly earlier with Dr. Judy Benz, but the Presidio Santa Rosa was occupied from 1722 to 1752 on the west end of Santa Rosa Island. So that's here in Pensacola. On the north side of the map, you can actually see the Pensacola Naval Air Station there. Just to kind of give you some context on where it is. This area has perpetual erosion. This is right by the Pensacola Pass, and the currents are really strong. And so there's a long, short current pulling across that's basically creating all this erosion. Um, Dredging activities in the past, especially in 1959, led to the need to put a bunch of dredged material somewhere. And so luckily, they were using the northern shore of Santa Rosa Island to do it. And they were able to extend the shoreline in places, I'm told, 500 feet into the bay and supposedly really thick in some areas, as thick as 30 feet. I've been trying to fact check that because that's a lot that's really deep. That's a lot of sediment. But that's what Dr. Benz told me, so that's what I'm telling you. But this is, kind of, it's not exactly beach renourishment, I would say. It's public land, it's part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, but it's certainly a stabilization thing. This was not done for the benefit of the Presidio. This was just done. It was certainly to stabilize that area with sediment, but this is really a secondary benefit here. And this is, 1959, so it's before a lot of our current commonplace historic preservation consultation practices. Unfortunately, the other site I've listed here, Fort McRae or McCree, it's been almost completely washed away. It's right there at the mouth, at the pass. So of course it's at even, greater risk already. But no stabilization efforts there, and unfortunately, it has cost the loss of that resource. Um, Subsequently, I think in large part because of those big losses with Fort McRae, the 2022 Sediment Budget Workshop report for Gulf Islands National Seashore, they it was this big surveying of folks, stakeholders, and they rated the effects of dredging and placement of material in the protection of historic forts, specifically as a 4 out of 5, both in terms of urgency and importance. And again, that was Fort McRae was something that was brought up. So this is part of the reason they're saying that. So we got some good and we got some bad, but at least it has drawn attention to the problem. Heading west, West Ship Island, they had the North Shore Restoration Project. It was put into law to restore the eroded northern shoreline of the island, and then aid in the continued stabilization of the whole Barrier Islands system off of Mississippi. An important and named component of the project was stabilization of the shoreline near Fort Massachusetts. So for the purposes of protecting that fort. Prior to the project, the site assessments determined that without any intervention, the fort was in peril. The foundation was going to be irreparably damaged by erosion. And so they were able to successfully connect East and West Ship Islands, which has aided more generally in the stabilization there. But also specifically with extra placement. You can see the image on the left, it's in the water. And then on the right, the area, you can see we've got plenty of beach in front of the fort. So it's been really a great example. And again, this was a named purpose. So good progress. Going up north into the mid-Atlantic. So this is going back to beach renourishment, which is really common and something the Army Corps does a lot of. So they've been doing beach renourishment projects up here on the Jersey coast since the year 2000 and the New York district and sometimes the Philadelphia district. But they've been monitoring these 4 shipwrecks located on the surf zone there going back since the year 2000. And the goal was to understand the effects of renourishment as part of their beach erosion control project. And they wanted to see how it impacted or protected the site. So they were trying to take an objective approach, like, is this actually good or not? Hoped it would be good. But the wrecks included the Chauncey Jerome Jr., that's listed on the National Register, the Adonis in the Western World, which are considered eligible, but they're not listed on it. And then the fourth one is the Amity, which had been recommended as ineligible. But the cool thing with these 4 sites is they have a really strong diving community in New Jersey and then going on over into Long Island. And all four of those sites were really popular dive sites. And generally speaking, the folks up there have been really good stewards of the site too. So although Amity wasn't even, considered eligible for listing on the National Register, they included it in this because it was such a popular dive site. So they understood the importance as a cultural resource outside of, our historic properties, criteria, and all that. So I thought that was a good move. But anyway, considerable amount of local research and site visits on that site. And the continued monitoring of the wrecks, and that included actual just diving on the sites and kind of recording, the old-fashioned way, certain features and how they'd been impacted, if anything, new was seen, areas exposed or covered, that sort of thing, but also a lot of geophysical survey. So going out there with the sonars and mapping and seeing how things change. Um, but they've noticed no obvious damage since they started this. So they're slowly being buried through the process of beach renourishment. And on the contrary, the unburied components, they have noticed obvious signs of damage. Features that have been moved, in some cases, obvious damage. And this is largely storm action. It's not recreational boat traffic or divers. This is, the increasing number of sudden storm activity and intense storm activity, particularly Hurricane Sally. That was a big one. Post Hurricane Sally, they definitely saw some noticeable problems. As of 2021, that was the last time I had gone up there. The geophysical survey showed that almost everything was buried. And so long term, that's going to be a good thing. Unfortunately, one of the impacts is divers can't go on the site anymore. So that is one thing we have to think about. But in terms of the long term um, preservation of these sites, it's a good thing. But yeah, almost, and there was just one small portion of one of these sites that was still exposed. Everything else was covered. And again, in light of an increasing number of hurricanes we can expect, this is a really good thing. And the Army Corps, they're continuing to monitor. This is an important part of those districts, and they're responsible a stewardship of the sites within their project areas. So a good program. Going back down south, so southern Louisiana, another project I worked on, this is the Bayou La Loutre Ridge Restoration. As you all know, I'm sure, large swaths of land in southern Louisiana, there's a lot of erosion happening, but there's a lot of subsidence too. And there's efforts to rebuild these landforms. Several groups, they're going after a lot of money to preserve existing habitats, but they're also doing a lot of habitat creation. And this was one of those projects. So they're restoring 110,000 feet of historic ridge and levee along Bayou La Loutre. So those ridges, it was all this natural levee development that has since subsided, and considerable portions are now underwater, if not at the waterline. So they're now suffering for increased erosion, in addition to the things that happen as those landforms just end up underwater. And so we did find some archaeological deposits out there. Nothing recommended as eligible for inclusion on the register, right? So it's kind of a different story, but these deposits, they are looking at those areas, and so they're being a little more sensitive in the ways that they are depositing the material. But regardless, these areas are going to benefit from this ridge restoration ultimately. They're going to be capped. There's going to be less erosion of the shoreline there. And so this is going to be a net good for those sites in this area. All right, so how do we fit into this? How do we protect more coastal archaeological sites? I think the main path is going to be stronger advocacy with these coastal management plans. So those are a part of the Coastal Zone Management Act. And finding ways to capture beneficial sediment use and in the planning stages. So they're looking at a coastal system and looking at all the natural and anthropogenic processes and then trying to manage them sustainably. So they're big factors, erosion, sedimentation, but now extreme storm events, especially in the south, the hurricanes, but also sea level rise, and then development. So land use. And It's often considered for the protection of natural resources, but as I mentioned earlier, these plans provide protections for local communities and cultural resources. So this goes beyond just beach renourishments. There's other things here. Coastal management plans are not only American either. It's kind of popular all over the world. There's similar programs in place. So if you do work outside of the U.S., you might be able to advocate for similar actions abroad. And some big ones I had kind of done some research on, excuse me. The Australia Marine and Coastal Management Plan, massive, or plans actually, they're just a big multinational thing. And then the Europe Shoreline Management Plan, similarly stretching across Europe, where they're really looking at sediment budgets and things like that, but across a much wider scale than, say, something that's just looking at like the Cape Fear River or something. These are massive. And there's various names and plans around the world, and I've got a lot of sources. If you're interested, I can share them. But they're already helping these coastal management plans to protect archaeological sites. It's just largely unintentional, right? Like it's something that's happening as a byproduct. But I think we can insert our concerns into the early stages of coastal management plans, make cultural resource protection a specific named outcome, and I think it will help coastal planners out too. So they're already considering social cultural impacts in their plans, including communities that are being affected by sea level rise and erosion. And so let's find a way to get, additional outlets, beneficial sediment usage within the management zones larger and look at synergies. So like if you've got a site that's in an at-risk zone, it's at risk in the context of its environment, right? Like it's not in a vacuum. So if we save the cultural resource, we're going to also save some habitat probably too. I mean, almost certainly. There's almost no way that's not happening. So let's just find a way to make it a higher priority, or just like, hey, it's just a little extra money. Let's make this happen too. This can be an important outcome for the local communities too, descendant populations and all that. Like, think about all the people that could benefit, and let's add that to the pile. And as anthropologists, we should be looking at everything, not just archaeological sites, but also think about TCPs, traditional cultural places, and maybe some outside the box cultural resources that we should be advocating for within these cultural, or excuse me, coastal management plans. At the larger scale, within the US, there's also regional sediment management, which is really interesting. That's a systems approach to address sediment management for sustainable solutions across multiple projects and programs. So it might be something like across the entirety of the Gulf Coast, say. Um, so those plans, they understand sediment as a limited resource, but they manage the total sediment needs across a region for all the stakeholders. And so that allows uh, the resource to be treated sort of as a budget. So like um, erosion, highly erosional areas could be running a sediment deficit, which would mean, okay, in order to provide sediment, we need to bring it from outside, sort of like they do with beach renourishment. Often it's, a borrow area, but it could also mean that there's another area with, say, a sediment budget excess, and maybe that material could be transported into your project area somehow or another. Really, really long pipelines, I guess, potentially, but there's potentially a path forward. Um, Including really important sites at that scale, I think is a good idea. So, with the added benefit of being quantifying the material needs that might be there, and I think that kind of helps everybody in the planning stage. I will say, going back earlier, the Fort Massachusetts, Fort Pickens, um, well, I mentioned Fort Massachusetts. I didn't mention Fort Pickens, but they were both included in this regional sediment budget for the Gulf Islands National Seashore as well. So kind of an interesting application. But yes, it is already happening. So to be a part of the process, you need to identify the important management groups in your area of concern. So at the federal level, the big folks, obviously, Army Corps for sure, but NOAA and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, National Marine Fisheries, Office of Coastal Management, Fish and Wildlife, all big. They're all part of the permitting and coordination picture. State agencies, the SHPO, right? A big one. Also, state DEPs. We have the water management districts in Florida, all big. But I think a really big one are these are a big part of this in terms of stakeholders would be the nonprofit organizations and also local sponsors, which can be municipal governments often. They're really good at developing the plans and going after the funding and then executing those plans, making sure they're seen through the way they were planned. Those groups are going to be more difficult to identify, though. But I do think that they're probably the strongest allies, although you may be accessing them by communicating with, say, the Army Corps, and the federal and state agency folks. But those are, I think, really good groups to tie in with, and some of the interdisciplinary uh, cooperative groups, certainly joint agreements and that sort of thing. And I think an important thing to remember as you seek these groups out is we don't just need them. I think they do need us. I think in order to have access to greater resources, they need to have a stronger argument. And I do think archaeological sites, cultural resources more broadly, historic properties, I think that helps them make their case, and potentially to broader audiences, but certainly I think it helps. So that's something to consider when you're going to their table. Um, so anyway, thank you. I hope this talk has given you some positive examples because I know a lot of what gets talked about is, well, I had this great site, 20 years ago. It's gone now, that sort of thing, which is unfortunate but true. But I also hope it inspires you to collaborate with some other scientists and specialists. And I also hope it inspires you to come back to me with some examples. Like I said, I would like to bring this back. And I think ultimately getting, some papers and articles outside of our umbrella. So like I was saying, some of these other coastal engineer, coastal management, ecological journals help get those guys to think about us. And then maybe they seek us out and we have even more outlets for it. But anyway, yes, and thank you very much for sitting through the talk. I very much enjoyed it. And if anybody has any questions, I'm ready to hear them.